The sky had turned dark, not gradually, but suddenly. It was the middle of the day. And yet, the sun refused to shine. Jerusalem stood still. The noise that once filled the streets had faded into an uneasy silence. People whispered. Some watched from a distance. Others turned away, unable to bear the sight, because on a hill just outside the city, 3 crosses stood, and on one of them was Jesus. His body was broken, his back torn open. Blood ran down from the crown of thorns pressed into his head. Every breath he took was a struggle. Every moment was pain. But this wasn't just suffering. This was something deeper, something no one around him could fully understand. Hours earlier, he had been standing before a crowd, accused, mocked, condemned. The same voices that once shouted, "Hosanna," were now screaming, "Crucify him!" And he said nothing. No defense, no argument, no resistance. As if he already knew this moment was coming. The soldiers had done their part. They whipped him. They struck him. They forced him to carry his own cross through the streets, step by step, until his strength began to fail. And yet, he kept going, not because he had to, but because he chose to. Now he hung there, between heaven and earth, rejected by people, surrounded by pain. And slowly, something began to change. At first, no one noticed. The soldiers continued their routine. The crowd watched. The religious leaders stood nearby, satisfied. But then, the sky grew darker. Not like evening, not like a passing cloud. This was different. This was heavy. This was unnatural. For 3 hours, darkness covered the land. No explanation, no warning, just silence and shadow. And in that moment, something happened that has confused people for centuries, something that still raises questions today, something that feels almost impossible to accept. Jesus cried out, not softly, not quietly, but with a loud voice that cut through the darkness. "My God! My God!" He paused, as if the weight of those words was too much to carry. Then he said it. "Why have you forsaken me?" The crowd heard it. The soldiers heard it. Even those standing far away heard it. And for a moment, everything stopped. Because this wasn't just pain speaking. This was something deeper. This was Jesus, the Son of God, saying that God had abandoned him. Think about that. The one who healed the sick, the one who raised the dead, the one who called God. Father now cries out, as if that connection is gone. Why? Was this just suffering? Or was something else happening behind the scenes? To understand this moment, you have to go back, not to the beginning of his life, but to something much older, something written long before this day ever came. Because those words, my God, why have you forsaken me?" They weren't random. They weren't new. They had been spoken before, hundreds of years earlier, in a psalm, written by a man named David, a man who also knew pain, who also cried out to God in moments of deep despair. That psalm began with the same words, the exact same cry. But it didn't end in despair. It ended in hope, in trust, in victory. So why would Jesus say those words now? At the moment of his greatest suffering? Was he simply expressing pain? Or was he pointing to something deeper, something hidden in plain sight? Back on the cross, his body was weakening. The pain was unbearable. Each breath came slower than the last. And still, the darkness remained. It wasn't just the sky. It felt like something else had gone silent too. For his entire life, Jesus had spoken of his Father. He prayed to him, trusted him, followed him. Even in the Garden of Gethsemane, just hours before this moment, he said, "Not my will, but yours be done." There was connection. There was closeness. There was presence. But now, something feels different. No response, no voice from heaven, no sign, just silence. And in that silence, he cries out again, not to the crowd, not to the soldiers, but to God. "My God, why have you forsaken me?" This wasn't a whisper. This was a cry that came from deep within, from a place of pain and something more. Because this moment wasn't just physical suffering. It was something far greater, something that goes beyond what the eyes could see. The people around him saw a man dying, a man being punished, a man who had lost. But what they didn't see was what was happening beneath the surface, because at that very moment, something was shifting, something eternal, something that would change everything. But to understand that, you have to ask a question most people avoid. Did God really abandon him? Or did it only look that way? Because sometimes what appears to be silence is actually part of something much bigger. And what looks like abandonment may not be abandonment at all. The cross wasn't just a place of suffering. It was a place of exchange, a place where something unseen was taking place. But no one there could fully understand it. Not the soldiers, not the crowd, not even the disciples who had already fled. All they saw was a man, alone. But was he really alone? Or was something happening that no human eyes could see? Because what happened next would reveal a truth that changes everything. The darkness didn't lift. It stayed, heavy, suffocating, unnatural, as if the world itself was holding its breath. On the cross, Jesus was still, barely moving. Every breath now came with effort. His chest rose slowly, then fell. Again and again. But something had changed, not just around him, within him. Because the pain he was feeling was no longer just physical. The nails in his hands, the wounds on his back, the crown of thorns, those were visible. People could see them, but there was something else, something invisible, something far heavier being placed on him in that moment, something no one around the cross could see. Sin. Not just one sin, not just a few, but all of it. Every lie ever spoken, every act of hatred, every moment of betrayal, every hidden thought, every wrong choice, from the beginning of time to the end of it, all of it was being placed on him. Think about that. Every mistake humanity had ever made, every darkness hidden in human hearts, every moment of rebellion against God, now resting on one person, on Jesus. The crowd didn't know this. The soldiers didn't understand. Even the few who still watched from a distance had no idea what was really happening, because this wasn't something you could see. There was no visible sign, no announcement, no explanation. Just silence. And yet, this was the moment everything was leading to. Because for years, people had followed laws, rules, sacrifices. Animals were offered. Blood was shed, again and again. But it was never enough. It covered sin, but it didn't remove it. It was temporary, incomplete. And now, something different was happening. This wasn't another sacrifice. This was the sacrifice, the final one. And the cost was unimaginable. Because sin isn't just a mistake. It creates separation, separation between people and God. And in that moment, Jesus wasn't just carrying sin. He was experiencing that separation. For the first time, the one who had always been in perfect connection with the Father now stood in the place of humanity. Alone, not because he deserved it, but because he chose it. That cry, "My God, why have you forsaken me?" It wasn't just about pain. It was about separation, real, deep, unbearable. Because for the first time, he was feeling what humanity feels without God. Distance, silence, emptiness. And it wasn't because God had stopped loving him. It was because he was carrying everything that separates humanity from God, all of it, at once. The weight of it was beyond anything the human mind can fully grasp. And yet, he didn't step down. He didn't stop it. He stayed. Why? Because this moment wasn't an accident. It was the plan, not a last-minute decision, not something that went wrong. This was always going to happen. Long before the cross, long before the nails, long before the crowd, this moment was set in motion. Because if sin creates separation, then someone had to step into that separation. Someone had to carry it. Someone had to take it fully so that others wouldn't have to. And that someone was Jesus. But here's the part most people struggle with. If God is loving, why would he allow this? Why would he allow his own son to go through this kind of suffering? Why allow that feeling of abandonment? Why allow that silence? It doesn't seem fair. It doesn't seem right. And that's exactly why this moment feels so heavy. Because it challenges what we think we know. It forces us to look deeper. Because maybe this wasn't about punishment. Maybe this was about something else. Something greater. Something that required a cost. Because forgiveness isn't free. It always costs something. And in this moment, the cost was being paid. Not by the guilty, but by the innocent. Jesus wasn't losing, even though it looked like it. He wasn't being defeated, even though it seemed that way. He was doing something that would change everything, something that couldn't be seen in that moment, but would be understood later. Because sometimes the most important things don't look like victory at first. They look like loss. They look like silence. They look like abandonment. But they're not. And that's what makes this moment so difficult to understand. Because what looked like God turning away may have actually been something else entirely. Something necessary. Something intentional. Something that had to happen for everything to change. And as the darkness continued and the weight grew heavier, Jesus remained on that cross, not because he had no power to leave, but because he chose to stay. And what he would say next would reveal something no one expected. The darkness was still there. It hadn't moved. It hadn't weakened. It simply remained, stretching across the land like a shadow that refused to lift. Time felt slower now. Every second carried weight. Every breath felt heavier than the last. And on that cross, Jesus was still holding on. To the people watching, it looked like the end. It looked like defeat. A man, broken and bleeding, hanging between life and death. The one who once spoke with authority, now struggling just to breathe. The one who calmed storms, now surrounded by silence. The one who raised others from death, now facing it himself. Everything about this moment screamed loss, but what they were seeing wasn't the full picture. Because sometimes what looks like defeat is actually the turning point. And this moment, this exact moment, was not the collapse of everything Jesus came to do. It was the completion of it. The crowd didn't understand that. Some stood there, watching with cold curiosity. Others mocked him, shaking their heads, repeating the same words again and again. He saved others, but he cannot save himself. They laughed. They assumed this was proof that he wasn't who he claimed to be, proof that his power had limits, proof that God had abandoned him. But they missed something important. He wasn't staying on that cross because he couldn't come down. He was staying because he chose not to. There's a difference, a powerful one. Because if this was truly defeat, he would have tried to escape. He would have resisted. He would have called for help. But he didn't. He remained silent, steady, intentional. Even in pain, there was purpose. And then something shifted again. Not in the sky, not in the crowd, but in his words. After hours of silence, after the weight of everything had been carried, Jesus spoke again. Not with confusion, not with fear, but with clarity. It is finished. 3 words, simple, but heavy with meaning. Because this wasn't the voice of someone losing. This was the voice of someone completing something. Something planned, something intentional, something finished exactly the way it was meant to be. The people around him didn't react much. Some didn't even understand what he said. To them, it sounded like the final words of a dying man, a quiet surrender, a sign that he was giving up. But it wasn't surrender, it was declaration. Because what was finished wasn't his life, it was the mission, the purpose, the reason he came. Everything that had been building up to this moment, every step, every word, every miracle, every prophecy had led here. And now it was complete. The weight of sin carried, the cost paid, the separation endured, all of it done. And in that moment, something invisible shifted. Not something the crowd could see, not something the soldiers could measure, but something eternal. Something that would change the relationship between God and humanity forever. Because if the cost has been fully paid, then nothing remains unpaid. If the weight has been fully carried, then nothing remains uncarried. And if the separation has been fully experienced, then the way back is now open. But no one there could see that yet. To them, it still looked like loss. It still looked like silence. It still looked like the end. And then, Jesus spoke one final time. "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit." Notice something. Just moments earlier, he cried, "My God, why have you forsaken me?" Now, he says, "Father." The connection wasn't broken forever. The silence wasn't permanent. The separation had a purpose, and now it was complete. And with that, he let go. Not forced, not taken, given. His life wasn't taken from him. He gave it, freely, fully. And in that moment, he died. The earth didn't stay still. It reacted. The ground began to shake. Rocks split apart. Something powerful had just happened. Something beyond human understanding. Even the Roman centurion, a man who had seen countless deaths, stood there looking at what just happened and said, "Surely this was the Son of God," because even he could feel it. This wasn't normal. This wasn't just another execution. This was something different, something significant, something divine. But still, the question remains. That moment on the cross, that cry, that silence, that feeling of abandonment. What was it really? Was God truly absent? Did he really turn away? Or was this something deeper, something necessary, something that only looks like abandonment from the outside? Because here's the truth most people miss. God didn't abandon Jesus out of rejection. Jesus stepped into separation so that others wouldn't have to. He experienced it, fully, completely, so that it wouldn't remain permanent for humanity. That moment wasn't God leaving. It was Jesus entering the place where humanity already was, and then making a way out. Which means what looked like the darkest moment was actually the beginning of something new. But no one standing there could see that yet. Because sometimes the most powerful moments in history don't look powerful in the moment. They look quiet. They look painful. They look like loss. But they're not. And what would happen next would prove that everything about this moment was never the end. The cross stood still. The body remained. The sky slowly began to return to its light. But something had already changed. Something irreversible. The darkness that once covered the land had begun to lift, but the weight of what had just happened still lingered in the air. People didn't fully understand it, but they could feel it. Something was different. Something had shifted beyond what their eyes could see. The crowd began to scatter. Some walked away in silence. Others whispered, unsure of what they had just witnessed. The same voices that once shouted now faded into uncertainty. Because moments ago, they were sure. Sure that this was the end. Sure that Jesus had lost. Sure that whatever he claimed had died with him. But now there was doubt. Not loud. Not obvious. But present. Quiet and growing. The soldiers remained near the crosses, doing what they always did, making sure everything was finished, making sure nothing was left undone. To them, this was routine. Another execution. Another body. Another day. But even among them, something felt different. The earthquake, the sudden darkness, the way he spoke, it wasn't normal. And even if they didn't understand it, they couldn't ignore it. Not far from the cross, something else was happening. Something hidden from the crowd. Something inside the temple. A curtain. Thick, heavy, massive. It separated the most sacred place from everything else. A barrier between people and the presence of God. No one could pass it. No one could cross it freely. It stood as a constant reminder that access was limited. That separation existed. That something stood in between. And at the exact moment Jesus died, that curtain tore. Not slowly, not partially, from top to bottom, completely, as if something invisible had just removed the barrier. No human hand could have done it. No priest could have caused it. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't coincidence. This was a sign, a powerful one, because what that curtain represented was now gone. The separation, broken. The distance, removed. The barrier, destroyed. And yet, most people outside didn't even know it had happened, because sometimes the most important changes happen where no one is looking. Back at the cross, his body still hung there, still, silent. The pain had ended, but the story hadn't, not even close, because what looked like the final chapter was actually the turning point. A few people remained, not the crowds, not the loud voices, just a small group, watching, mourning, trying to understand. Among them, those who had followed him, those who believed, those who had seen his power and now stood in confusion. Because this wasn't what they expected. This wasn't how they thought it would end. They had seen miracles. They had heard his words. They believed he was the one. And yet, here he was, lifeless, silent, still. It didn't make sense. And that's what made this moment so heavy. Because when something doesn't make sense, it creates doubt. It creates questions. It creates silence in the mind. And that silence can feel just as heavy as the darkness that once covered the sky. But what they didn't know was that silence was about to break. Because what just happened on the cross was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of something they could never have imagined. Because if the barrier is gone, then access is open. If the cost is paid, then nothing remains unpaid. If the separation is broken, then connection is possible again. But none of that felt real yet. Because all they could see was death. And death always feels final. It always feels complete. It always feels like the end. But this death was different. Because this wasn't defeat. This wasn't failure. This wasn't the collapse of hope. This was the moment everything shifted. And yet, it happened so quietly. No celebration, no announcement, no immediate understanding. Just silence, just confusion, just waiting. Because sometimes the biggest changes don't come with noise. They come with stillness. And in that stillness, something begins, something unseen, something that takes time to be revealed. The body was taken down, carefully, respectfully, not like a criminal, but like someone who mattered, someone who was loved, someone who had changed lives. Even in death, there was a sense that this was not ordinary. He was placed in a tomb, sealed, guarded, secured. Everything about it said one thing: finished, over, done. But if there's one thing this story keeps showing, it's that what looks finished is not always finished, because silence doesn't always mean absence. Stillness doesn't always mean nothing is happening. And endings aren't always the end. Sometimes they're just the moment before everything changes. And that's exactly where this story is now. Right between what was and what's about to happen. Right between death and something no one expected. Because the question isn't just, did God abandon Jesus? The real question is, what was God doing in that silence? Because what happens next will answer everything, and it will reveal that the silence was never empty. The tomb was sealed, a heavy stone placed at the entrance, guards stationed, no movement, no sound, no hope. At least, that's how it looked. The world had moved on. The crowd had disappeared. The noise was gone, and in its place, there was silence. The kind of silence that feels final. The kind that makes people believe it's over. For those who followed him, this silence felt different. It wasn't peaceful. It wasn't calm. It was heavy, confusing, painful. Because everything they believed, everything they hoped for, now stood still in a sealed tomb. They had seen him heal. They had seen him speak with authority. They had seen things no one else could explain. And yet, none of that seemed to matter now. Because death has a way of making everything feel finished. And still, the question remained. That moment on the cross. That cry. My God, why have you forsaken me? Was it real abandonment? Was God truly absent? Or was something else happening that no one understood at the time? Because now, standing in the silence of the tomb, the weight of that question feels even heavier. If God truly left him, then this was the end. But if he didn't, then this silence means something else. And that's where everything begins to shift. Because what looked like abandonment was never abandonment. It was purpose. It was plan. It was something far deeper than human understanding. Jesus wasn't rejected. He stepped into the place of separation so that it could be broken forever. He didn't lose connection permanently. He carried the moment of distance so that others wouldn't have to live in it. That cry on the cross was not the end of relationship. It was the cost of restoring it. Because if sin creates distance, then someone had to step into that distance fully, completely, without holding back. And that's exactly what he did. Which means God didn't abandon Jesus out of rejection. God allowed that moment because it was necessary. Necessary for something greater. Necessary for something eternal. Necessary for something that would change everything. And now, in the silence of the tomb, that work was complete. Nothing left to carry. Nothing left to pay. Nothing left unfinished. But still, the world didn't know that yet. Because truth doesn't always reveal itself immediately. Sometimes it waits. Sometimes it unfolds slowly. Sometimes it comes after the silence. And this silence was about to break. Because what happened on the cross was never meant to end in death. It was meant to lead somewhere. Somewhere no one expected. Somewhere no one could control. Somewhere no one could stop. Because if death was truly the end, then the story would stop here. But it doesn't. And that's what changes everything. Because the same Jesus who cried out in what seemed like abandonment is the same Jesus who would soon reveal that he was never truly defeated. That moment of silence was not emptiness. It was transition. It was the space between what was finished and what was about to begin. And when that silence finally broke, everything changed. The fear, the doubt, the confusion, all of it would be replaced, not with questions, but with something far stronger. Truth. The kind of truth that doesn't just explain something, but transforms how you see everything. Because now, looking back at that moment on the cross, you begin to understand something deeper. That cry was not weakness. It was weight. That silence was not absence. It was purpose. That moment was not defeat. It was victory, hidden inside suffering. And that's what makes this so powerful. Because it changes the question. Instead of asking, did God abandon Jesus? You start asking, what was God accomplishing in that moment? Because once you see it clearly, everything shifts. The cross is no longer just a place of pain. It becomes a place of meaning, a place of exchange, a place where something broken was made whole. And suddenly, that moment of darkness doesn't feel empty anymore. It feels intentional. It feels necessary. It feels like part of something bigger. And maybe that's the part most people miss. Because sometimes, the moments that feel like silence in your own life, the moments that feel distant, the moments where it seems like nothing is happening, aren't what they appear to be. Maybe they're not abandonment. Maybe they're part of something you don't fully see yet. Because if the cross teaches anything, it's this. What looks like the end is not always the end. What feels like silence is not always empty. And what seems like distance may actually be part of something greater. So the next time you think, where is God in this moment? Remember this. There was a moment when everything looked lost. When everything felt silent. When even Jesus cried out as if he was alone. And yet, that moment changed everything. Not because God left, but because something bigger was happening. Something that would never leave humanity the same again. And maybe that's the truth beneath it all. If this made you see the cross differently, if it made you question what you've always believed, then you're starting to look deeper. And that's where real understanding begins. Subscribe to Truth Beneath Faith. Because not everything you've been told is the full story. And the deeper you look, the more you'll discover what's been there all along.